So let's do this. We're gonna go for about an hour and a half. And so you ready?
Yeah.
Robert Temple's in the house. For those of you who don't know who he is, we just had him on a few months ago discussing a book called A New Science of Heaven. It's based on his research on plasma. Fascinating topic. But I got to tell you, I have been a fan of Robert Temple's for many, many years. And that's because he wrote a fascinating book called The Sirius Mystery. Would you believe it was written in 1976? And what an influential book this was. People like Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, John Anthony West, my friend Robert Anton Wilson, and many, many other authors have been influenced by this book. And it came out so many years ago. It's a great pleasure to have Robert on the program. I didn't mention this before. I wanted to read a little bit about his background. He is a member of the Royal Astronomical Society, the Society for the Promotion of Hellenistic Studies, the Egypt Exploration Society, the Royal Historical Society, the British School of Archaeology at Athens, the Institute of Classical Studies, so forth and so on. He's written 9 books, and I mentioned the book recently, A New Science of Heaven. But Robert, great to see you again. We have a lot to talk about. This book is fascinating. And I want to start by mentioning that this was originally an article that you wrote based on a selection. I think you talk about connecting with a noted individual, and he is looking at various tribes, and he says this is the Dogon are the most unusual. And you said, okay, I'm interested in that. Talk a little bit about how this got launched and what the focus was back then, because that's fascinating that this was an article that turned into a book.
Well, I'll try to give you the short version of the story.
Yeah.
When I was an undergraduate, first of all, I went to university at the age of 16 rather than 18. And so I tended, my classmates found it maybe a little bit embarrassing to be with somebody who they regarded as a bit of
a kid.
So it was kind of natural for me to make friends with the older boys who weren't embarrassed any longer because they were a bit more grown up, and the idea of conversing with a 16-year-old wasn't considered embarrassing. And so I befriended a wonderful boy called John Coggeshall, who was at least 4 years older than me, I think. And he was sitting having a Coke, and we had a Coke together in what passed for a very basic, not really a student union. It was just the University of Pennsylvania, this is in Philadelphia. They didn't really have a student union then, and everything was a bit primitive. But I don't think I would like it today. I liked it primitive. So he and I got talking, and he said that when he came to Penn, that his father had told him to look up his friend who was called Arthur Young, because John's father, Calvert Coggeshall, had worked with this chap, Arthur Young, who was an inventor, who invented the Bell helicopter, the one with the glass bubble. And John's father had actually worked on the bubble of the helicopter. And so John dutifully went off and met Arthur Young, who is an absolutely fascinating man and was much more interesting than merely just a helicopter inventor, because he was a very profound philosopher and student of every branch of science. He had studied mathematics at Princeton under Veblen, and he was frankly a genius. And he liked younger people and used to have them come see him and for scientific discussions and that kind of thing. And this is how I met Arthur Young when I was 16. And so I started seeing Arthur more than John did. And because John was often busy with ROTC, he ended up as an officer in the Army for a while after he left university. But I didn't do ROTC. And so I had more time available, and I would walk to Center City where Arthur lived. He had a big house there. And I got into the habit of dropping in because Arthur was always there reading and studying, and he had the most charming wife called Ruth. And I'd be asked to stay for dinner, which was, I must confess, quite an attraction, a good idea, because I wasn't eating very much. And so I dropped into Arthur one day, and I was called Bob then, because everybody in America is called Bob, whereas here in England, I'm Robert, but they won't let me be called Bob. And that's not formal enough, you see. And so he said, "Oh, Bob, I'm reading a very interesting book. It's called African Worlds, edited by somebody called Darrell Ford." See, I don't know who Darrell Ford is. I just got this book because it's got a chapter about, each chapter is about a different African tribe. So it's a whole collection of chapters about a whole collection of tribes. And he said it's very interesting, and they're all very different from one another. And most people don't realize how different the African tribes are from one another, which in itself is an interesting subject. And he said, but the most amazing African tribe are called the Dogons. The Dogons. He mispronounced what we now know is should be Dogon. He thought that was quite funny. The Dogons, that Dogon tribe. And he said that their religion and culture are entirely based on the star Sirius. He said, I found that very strange. They say that there's a star that goes around Sirius, and they talk all about that. It's really the star that goes around Sirius that interests them rather than Sirius itself. He said, I wonder if there is a star that goes around Sirius. I said, oh, yes, because I knew a bit of astronomy. And I said, well, yes, Arthur, there is actually a star going around Sirius. That's why it's called a binary star system. And it goes around, I forget how many years, and it's a small star, what they call a white dwarf, which I suppose these days would be called racist or colonialist for a dwarf to be white, wouldn't it? So, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Very un-PC joke. So I said, I'm going to go back and check in one of my astronomy books just to make sure this, because you have to bear in mind there was no internet then. You couldn't just go to your computer and look something up.
Right.
You had to have a book or go to the library. I was practically living in the university library anyway. And I looked it up, and then I went to see him again. I said, Arthur, there is a star going around Sirius every 50 years. Sirius B, call it. The astronomers call it B, and the main star is A. And so he said, well, let me get this book out again and look at it. And he said, well, the Dogon, he said, the Dogon tribe say that there's this little star that goes around Sirius every 50 years. But that's what you just told me you look up in an astronomy book. I said, well, how could they know that? Nobody can see the little star.
Right.
It's very difficult to see because it's so small and it's sort of blotted out by the enormous light coming from Sirius A. And I said, well, there's no way a tribe in Africa without modern scientific telescopes could know about this star, much less know the orbital period. This is ridiculously strange. And we agreed that it was ridiculously strange. And but then, I was involved in things, and he was involved in things, and I didn't pursue it, and neither did he. I then moved to England, and I got interested because I had by that time met Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, and in fact I spent 2 years watching Kubrick make the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and so I was reading Arthur's books. I mean, the other Arthur C. Clarke's books, and all about extraterrestrial life and this kind of thing. And he not only wrote the science fiction novels, he wrote essays and what have you. And we talked a lot because he's a completely open guy. And on his visits to England from Ceylon, where he lived, which Ceylon is now called Sri Lanka, then he would be very open to seeing people in pubs. He was never a stuffy person who had a big idea about himself. He was a completely normal human being, and was never egocentric. The very opposite of the horrible Carl Sagan, who was so stuck on himself. He was the kind of male Meghan Markle, who's not my favorite woman. And so I don't like these kind of narcissistic, egotistic people.
Yeah.
So Arthur was the opposite. He was totally open. And so he got me really thinking about space and life in space. And I met several of the people doing all of that. I got to know Asimov and various people of that sort. And so I wrote to Arthur, because there were no emails, remember? This is long ago. You had to do snail mail. I wrote to Arthur and I said, can you remind me of the name of that book where the Dogon tribe were discussed, and who had their culture based on the little star going around Sirius? And he looked it up and sent me a photocopy of the chapter. He was very good that way. But I was doing a bit of research for him always. I helped him write his 2 main books because his writing style was very bad at first. He later became excellent at it. But he was not a natural writer to start with. And so I used to help him with the style and so on, and do research for him. And I discovered some of his fundamental things that he put in his books. We worked well together. despite the huge age gap, which we ignored. And so then I got that, and I went to the Royal Anthropological Society in London, which still existed then. It shut down a few years later. And they had a big library. And I said, what have you got about the Dogon tribe? And the librarian said, oh, you mean the Dogon tribe, which is when I first learned how to pronounce their name. And he said, oh, lots of things. And I went to something that younger people would never have heard of called card index, because the libraries had all their books listed on their cardboard cards, and you pull them out of a drawer of drawers,
Index cards, yeah.
Cards. I'm sure nobody under 40 has ever seen one, but that's how it was. And so I saw all these things, and everything was in French, because the anthropologists who had studied them were French, because this was in a country called Mali, which used to be French Equatorial Africa, they called it. Or even they used to call it the French Sudan, which is kind of a strange thing to call it. And so this is long before Mali became an independent republic. And I found one article that had Sirius in the title. I thought, oh, that's the one I need, because I want to find out more about this crazy Sirius idea. What does this tribe think they're talking about? Talking about the star Sirius, and how do they know the orbital period of its companion? And so I got this. Now, I couldn't read French, and so I got somebody to do a very poor translation of it, which wasn't very good, but it gave me enough information to go on with. And so I thought, I've got to look into this a lot more. And then I came to the conclusion that it was such a strange tale that I should write an article about it, because I had by that time started doing a bit of journalism. Well, in fact, I had actually started journalism when I was still in America, but it was slower getting started in London, where I didn't know anybody. I wrote an article about this, saying as much as I knew at that time, which wasn't necessarily very much, but I just wanted to call attention to this, because my idea was, or somebody more qualified than myself will go off and investigate this, which needs investigating. I was convinced of it. I couldn't get any editor of any magazine to take it seriously. And they would say things like, well, we'd have to know much more. This is too weird. I mean, where did you get this from? And then I then expanded the article by doing more research to become more convincing to them that it was important enough to publish the article. And this completely flopped, and I couldn't get anybody to take any notice of it at all. This is, they wouldn't take it seriously. It was too weird. Their idea was, this can't be true, therefore we're not going to publish it. So then I thought, well, I'm going to go on looking into this, even if I can't publish an article. And I kept researching more and more and more, and it turned into a book. Well, then I thought, well, what do I do with a book? Because I didn't have an agent, or I'd never published a book. And I was a young guy that nobody ever heard of. I didn't.
Were you a university student when you were writing this book, or had you graduated already? Okay. So this is written in England, pretty much. Okay. All right.
In America.
Okay.
And so then, just because I happened to have a friendly neighbor in London he was a gay guy whose boyfriend or partner, as one would say now, was a literary agent. He said, well, look, I'll introduce you to him. I didn't find him very friendly, but he said that he'll take you on and be your agent for your book and place publisher. They offered it to a publisher called Sedgwick and Jackson, which was an independent publisher. There aren't any left now, but there were plenty then, which was a very strange place. I can't get into the story of Sedgwick and Jackson. Well, that's the subject of another conversation. And so they accepted the book right away. To the great surprise of the agent, because he didn't think anybody would take this nonsense. And so I got the vast sum of £250 for this book.
That was your advance, or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
I had a royalty deal, but that was 1973. So I delivered the book in 1973. The publisher, they took 3 years to get around to publishing it, because they had no interest in it, and they thought, this is a ridiculous book. Nobody's going to buy it. But, after 3 years of my nagging them, meanwhile, I only had the £250. See, I wasn't earning any money from this great venture. And they finally decided, oh, well, we'll bring it out. And they published it in 1976. And during the interval, I wrote the appendices that are at the back of that book, which were a very interesting one about the Greek philosopher Proclus, who knew about invisible moons and planets and things. And I wrote that one up. And so it came out. And to everybody's total astonishment, most of all, the astonishment of my publishers, who did not think the book was worth a penny, it got lead favorable rave reviews in the Times and the Telegraph, which are the two major newspapers in London. They simply couldn't believe it. Times and the Telegraph both thought that I was the best thing since sliced bread, and that the book was wonderful, which made the people at the publishers feel rather small and stupid, which were. And anyway, it went on from there. And it started getting, and then it was a big television coverage on the BBC about it, and various things happened like that. And so then it sold all over the world. It became a huge bestseller in Germany. It was, I think, on the bestseller list in Germany for 2 years.
Now, wasn't there some serious scientific paper journals like Nature that picked it up and were very favorably?
It was very favorably reviewed by a professor of astronomy in Nature as a lead review in one of the Nature issues.
You hit a home run out of the park with this book. You were like, the scientific community pretty much embraced it, right?
They did, absolutely. And that lasted for about a year. And then by 1977, I became the target of a coordinated character assassination campaign by a group of people who were basically run by a certain intelligence agency that might be in the same country where you are at the moment.
Well, I want to, before we get into that, and this is very strange what happened. We're talking the late 70s, and first we get a positive reaction from the scientific community.
Universal.
I mean, we have Nature by itself is a huge, very, very prestigious magazine. For them to say, you've got something here, we like it, so forth and so on, accolades from them. And then all of a sudden, a year later, the intelligence community, CIA, MI6, start turning on you. Why? Why does this happen?
Well, that's what I wanted to know. I now realize that they don't like anybody to get really close to the serious, that's no pun intended, issues concerning extraterrestrial intelligence. In other words, they want to totally control the narrative on that subject. And if it's crazy people writing about flying saucers, they don't care. But if it's somebody who's starting to get praised in Nature magazine, then I was considered a threat.
So, I mean, that doesn't make sense to me, especially during the time when you're writing this, because we got people, well, maybe what you're saying is the case. You're getting accolades from the scientific community, and they would rather have you be Ancient Alien, perhaps Eric Van Daniken kind of.
They don't worry about that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's too frivolous for them to worry about. How bad did this oversight affect you?
Oh, it was terrible, really terrible, and it included Carl Sagan as one of the main people, because he was a CIA guy.
Yeah.
And now I had spoken to Isaac Asimov prior to this, and he had read my book and thought it was wonderful, and he said he kept looking for mistakes and errors, and he said to me, I couldn't find a single mistake or error in your book anywhere, as if he was amazed. And he was really in favor of it. And then only weeks later, he turned against me and started savagely attacking me, which totally was in contradiction to what he had privately said to me, because he'd been given his instructions, you see. Because there's this group of SICOP, Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, SICOP was the name of their group. And the members of that took their instructions from on high. And if it was an enemy like me who surfaced, an enemy to the total control of the a serious discussion of anything extraterrestrial, then they would target that person and systematically and relentlessly publish terrible articles accusing me of being an idiot. Everything was wrong. And Sagan published an article attacking me in Omni magazine, which older people might remember. It was a very, very glossy magazine. And I wrote to the editor. I complained to Arthur. He said, "Oh, write to the editor. I know him." And so I said that everything that Carl Sagan said about the book in his article is wrong. I mean, to the most ludicrous extent, he's got everything wrong. And the charges he levels against me are totally false. And may I please have the right of reply and write an article myself correcting all of that? And so I got a reply from them saying, "We don't want to upset Carl." I said, "Well, look," he said, "Well, I don't want to attack Carl. I want to set the record straight and correct all these errors." And they refused to let me publish even one word, even as a letter. But you see, that was in terms of defending myself. But it got much worse because the CIA then targeted me for many, many, many years. And they would approach people whom I knew and tell them terrible things about me, which weren't true. For instance, I made an arrangement to write 40 training videos with a guy who had a video company. And we did one, a very good one that was. We were going to do 39 more just for starters. This was going to become a really major business. These were scientific training videos. He phoned me and he said, Robert, I'm not supposed to tell you this. I've been warned not to tell you. He said, but you're such a good friend and I like you so much. And I feel so bad about this that I feel honor bound to tell you what's happened. He said, I can't work with you. I said, what do you mean? We've already got an agreement. We've already made our first film. No. It's not that I don't want to work with you, Robert. He said, I can't work with you. I said, what do you mean you can't work with me? He said, well, Robert, the CIA have come to see me. Now we're talking about, he lives in England.
Yeah.
But the CIA came to see him in England. And they said, we understand you're doing a series of films with Robert Temple. You can't do that. You must stop. If you don't stop, we will destroy your business. He said, what do you mean? That's ridiculous. And he tried to not go along with that for a few weeks. And he said they were pestering him every day, phoning him, coming to see him, threatening him. And he said that he hated to tell me this because he felt like a jerk. But he said he couldn't afford to have his whole life and his whole business ruined.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to work together. He said it was more than it was worth to him to go on working with me because the CIA would take their revenge against him.
Yeah, Robert, you write something fascinating in this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to talk about it because you considered, they were considering you what you call a security threat.
Yes.
And this is because
because I'm telling the public things.
Yeah, this actually moves into the present time when we're talking about unidentified aerial phenomenon or the new term UAPs. Anything to do with off-world aliens, UFOs, any kind of clarity that isn't comic book like Ancient Aliens and books like that relate to that. And someone like you who's a serious researcher in the scientific realm, this is a problem for this security agency, for the CIA and MI6. And you are a threat, I guess, to the point where they didn't want anybody to have anything to do with you. So
they wanted to destroy me completely.
Yeah.
Now, I was already a member of something called the Royal United Services Institute for Defense Studies in London.
Yeah.
And this because I was interested in defense and I used to go along to the talks and then you get people like the head of NATO and so on and the defense minister coming along. And sometimes you'd even get to chat with them. I was fascinated, just pure amateur interest. I wasn't involved in any of this kind of thing, defense. And so one day at tea after a lecture, because we used to all go up to the director's office and have tea in those days. And a chap I was very friendly with called Brigadier Bidwell, who was always there, came up to me at tea and he said, Robert, I've read your book, The Sirius Mystery. What? Where did you read what? Why would you read my book, The Sirius Mystery? You're not interested in that sort of thing. You're a military historian. I know. I would never normally have read it. I was told I had to. I said, what do you mean you were told you had to read my book, The Sirius Mystery? I mean, it's just so un-you. Because he was a very straight guy, older guy, retired, of course. He said, well, I was told, I was approached, and they said, this Robert Temple, you're very friendly with him. You have to read his book and write a report on it and tell us what you think and give us a report on what you think of him and him in connection with this book. This was for the British security people because the trouble originated in America. It didn't originate in Britain. It was the Americans pressing the Brits. And so he said, so I read it. I found it very interesting. I mean, I didn't think I would. The last thing I would normally read. He said, but when I got into it, I thought, this is very interesting. So I just wanted to congratulate you, Robert, on writing that strange, very interesting book, and which is not very cool. This is not what he's meant to have done. Of course, he's meant to have attacked me. And he said, I wrote a report about it. And I said how interesting it was. And of course, this did not go down well with the CIA. And several people behaved like that and told me about it. Many people approached me and said, you won't believe it. Arthur C. Clarke, he phoned me from Sri Lanka one day. And this is when making those kind of long distance calls was quite a hassle. couldn't do a direct dial. I had to go through operators. And he called me Bob. He said, Bob, I don't want to alarm you unduly, but I just want to warn you about something. He said, I've discovered, because he was very friendly with all the guys at NASA, and I was friendly with a couple of the guys from NASA. He said, I want to warn you because Isaac, which was Asimov, and his group are going for you. They're going to try and destroy you. They are very, very dangerous enemies of yours. And he said, I don't know what you can do to stop them or to protect yourself, but I wanted to warn you that these are very dangerous people and they're going for you. And that was Arthur Clarke, who was the mildest of men, and he never criticized anyone. And for him to call attention to me because I was his friend, that I was in danger because of these weird people, some of whom were supposedly his friends, like Asimov, were determined to knock me out of the picture. This is what it was like, and there are many, many more examples. I wrote replies to most of the printed attacks, and I published them as a pamphlet, which is downloadable from the website www.researchgate.net. I think it's the date is 1977. You type in my name.
Yeah.
You go down the list, they're chronologically listed, all my technical papers and things. Go down to 1977 and you will find it's a pamphlet called The Sirius Mystery Answering the Critics, in which I totally demolish Carl Sagan and all the other guys.
Yeah.
And already 12,000 people have downloaded that.
How many? 12,000 people?
Downloaded that without my telling.
It must be filled with fascinating replies to these attacking letters. I want to get into the fundamentals of this book, Robert.
No, it wasn't 1977. Hold on, I've got it wrong. It was 1997.
97, quite a few years later.
Yes, that's because in 1998, I brought out a new edition of the Sirius Mystery.
Yeah.
Expanded with 50% more material.
Yeah.
You've seen it, and that's the one that's currently in print, and that it has a lot more information in it. And the reason I brought it out was that some astrophysicists verified one of the statements of the Dogon tribe about the Sirius star system, and it was verified by some astrophysicists. And so it was like verifying a prediction, you see. And so I brought the book out again in expanded form, highlighting the fact that the information in it, which was considered to be impossible, had just been verified. Equally embarrassing to people, that then became popular.
You're basically verifying that aliens came to Earth, left their impressions with this African tribe.
No, not with the African tribe. No. The story, they maintain that they got all this information. Their ancestors got all the information.
Okay.
On visiting aliens, but it never happened in Africa. The Dogon never claimed that anybody had visited them in Africa, and they've only been in Africa for 1,000 years.
Where did their ancestors actually reside?
Well, this has all been traced by anthropologists, quite separate from my work. And so I discovered all of that and put it into the Sirius Mystery to explain who are these Dogon and where did they come from? Well, they all came down from the oasis of the Fezzan, Fezzan, which is in the Sahara Desert, about 1,000 years ago. They looked a bit like sort of Arab skin color, and then they intermarried with local people so that they're now very black in appearance. But you know that the reason why people are black is to protect their bodies from the ultraviolet radiation. So that's why skins are darker for people living in the tropics, because the UV would kill them otherwise. So the melanin fills up the skin, and you get darker and darker and darker the further south you go, the nearer the equator you are, so that you survive. That's why there are people whose skins are black. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily African. You get that with Ethiopians. You get it with some of the people in Sri Lanka. You get it with all people around the world, the Dravidians in India. This is all to do with ultraviolet radiation affecting the skin. And so the reason why people are so weird about taking any notice at all of skin color, which I don't, is because they don't understand what skin color means. This is where all this weird racism comes in, which is so pointless and stupid. It's literally superficial, and that is pun intended, because what could be more superficial about a person than how much melanin they've got in their skin.
Exactly.
You get all the white people, what do? They lie in the sun to get a tan. They end up darker than the people that they feel racist against.
Right.
And yet they think that's beautiful. But it's not beautiful if it's on somebody else, only them lying in the sun. This is total insanity, the whole skin color nonsense.
So when was the first contact of these aliens?
So they maintained that it was in the very distant past. So then I traced the ancestors back much further than the oasis of Fazan. They were a tribe that lived in North Africa for millennia. They were living in Libya and Algeria and that area for a very long time. They were very well known, and they were even mentioned by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. And I constructed a map of the North African tribes as described by Herodotus, depending on his descriptions upon the sequence in which you encountered them as you went in whatever direction. And I was able to produce the first map of the North African tribes in the 4th century BC. But these people were already there. And so the chief god of the Dogon tribe is called, well, let's put it like this. The people who came into North Africa came from Egypt, from the oasis of Siwa. Their god's name is the same as the god's name in the Dogon tribe. And I purchased in Paris a number of years ago an object made by one of the native tribes, that is the related tribes, because there's 4 tribes in Mali who have this tradition. One of them is the Bambara. And I bought a Bambara artifact, which is a perfect depiction of the ancient Egyptian dog god Anubis, but it was a couple of hundred years old. You can buy these things very easily in Paris, these ancient artifacts of the African tribes. And so I had this ancient Bambara depiction of Anubis, but they all have the ancient Egyptian traditions, you see. And a whole book was written about this. The southernmost of those migrating tribes are the people of Ghana, known as the Akan, A-K-A-N, who are very numerous. And they maintain in their traditions all kinds of ancient Egyptian details. So what happened was these people were religious minority who were expelled from Egypt, and they didn't like the changes taking place, perhaps at the time of Akhenaten, who knows, and they left Egypt. They first went to the oasis of Siwa, and then they just became a big tribe all over the north of Africa. And they ended up in Western Africa, and they constitute the 5 tribes as follows: the Dogon, the Bambara, the Minyanka, and the Bozo being the ones who live by the river and fish, and then the Akan of Ghana. Those are the 5 tribes descended from the ancient Egyptians in Western Africa.
That's fascinating.
And so they claim that the beings from another world, from the system of the star Sirius, where they claim there's a planet, and they know the difference between planets and stars, talk to the ancestors in the original homeland. So in other words, they would have visited Egypt, not...
Oh my God, really? Present day Egypt.
Well, this is what they claim, you see.
Yeah.
I didn't make any of this up. I'm repeating the traditions and what's known by anthropologists. But this is not a fantasy that I've invented. I'm a messenger. Don't shoot the messenger.
No, I think it's fascinating. On the front of the most recent edition, it says new scientific evidence of alien contact 5,000 years ago. Well, in the annals of Egyptian history, that's not that. I mean, that's old. That's old kingdom. Old dynasty. Does this go before that?
Well, those things that go on jackets of books are not necessarily written by the author.
I agree. I've had that happen to me. Go ahead.
So we don't know when this occurred, but it seems that it did. And so we're faced with this, but the book is called The Sirius Mystery because I admit that it's a mystery.
Yeah.
No answer yet. But my hypothesis is that it's probably true that there was this visitation. So who are these people? I then have a whole chunk of the book about who these beings were and so on. Lots of details and depictions.
This is the Nommo.
Yes. The Dogon tribe called them the Nommo, and they had fishtails that they were amphibious, that they preferred to live in the sea, but they could come out of it for a while, but then they'd go back to the sea. And I discovered the same tradition existed among the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And then ancient Athens was meant to be founded by such a person. Even ancient China was founded by the Fuxi and his wife, who were fish-tailed beings. And all over the world, we have this legend that civilization, as we would consider it as being civilization, that is, people growing crops and having cities and writing books and all of that, commenced with the teachers being these sort of fish people. Now, were they like sort of dolphin types? They couldn't walk. They had to go about in sort of cart type things because they didn't have legs, you see.
This is fascinating.
There's even a very obscure tradition among the very ancient Greek mythological lore that Zeus himself didn't have legs, that they were joined together. And so this permeates everywhere. And so because I like doing research into ancient cultures, and I did study a lot of that at university, and I've never stopped studying it, I was able to trace that these traditions of the fish people founding Earth civilization was all over the place and many countries. And now it could have reached China from the Babylonians, because we do know, and my friend Joseph Needham worked out, because I did a book with him, History of Chinese Science, that the Chinese astronomy was based upon Babylonian astronomy. The tradition of the fish hero could have come from the Babylonians to China.
I want to ask you, though, Robert, when we talk about ancient contact with alien beings, you have to look at Zecharia Sitchin's book and the Anunnaki. He gives dates of 400,000 years ago quite regularly based on what he believes are clay tablet interpretations. You don't actually say that in your...
No. I don't go along with Sitchin's dates. I also have a very strong dislike for Sitchin. He's a very unpleasant man. I don't know if he's still alive.
No, he passed away several years ago.
Well, good riddance. But, he was a very unpleasant man. Really, really, really unpleasant man. And he sort of went way out beyond the pale. He did seem to be able to read the tablets because he was a bit scholarly. And
I guess my question to you, though, is that if you're not giving... You're saying the 5,000 was the publisher's subtitle for your cover. What would you say? And we're talking about very ancient cultures. You're talking about Babylonians and Sumerians and ancient dynastic Egyptians. That can go back, 5, 7, 8,000 years. If you were to give a date for this contact, can you suggest a period of time? Is this an earlier epic prior to written history?
It's very difficult to be precise about this because there's so little certainty about some of the standard chronologies anyway. I was part of an archaeometric team that did work in Egypt with the permission of the Ministry of Antiquities, and we redated various monuments, and we discovered, for instance, that the pyramids were older than is conventional, but maybe like 1,000 years old or that kind of time. I don't go along with the dates that people like Shock insist on, and I've never met Shock. He's published some bad stuff about me, which I didn't take to be very friendly, considering we didn't even know each other, and some attacks on me, all to do with this kind of subject of dating. And I knew Boval and Graham Hancock very well, and I didn't like West, but I was the first person actually ever to publish West, strangely enough, because when I was editing that magazine that I mentioned, when we were talking privately earlier about Fred Hoyle, back in 1979, I published an article by this guy called West about the Sphinx, which I myself didn't believe in. I didn't support it, but I'm not the sort of person who, as a magazine editor, only would publish things that I think are right. So I thought, let everybody say their thing. And so I actually got West going, and then on the basis of that, he got his book together. But of course, he was quite bitter about that because he didn't like the fact he would never admit to anybody that I had given him his first say in print about the Sphinx, especially because I disagreed with him about the Sphinx. And I think I know more about the Sphinx than he ever did. I've written an entire book on the Sphinx, and I've been inside the Sphinx, which has a tunnel inside, believe it or not. And I've been in it and I photographed it. And I found, because I'm good at historical research and textual research, I was able to find, I went in all the accounts of travelers visiting Egypt over the centuries, I was able to discover continual reports of a chamber underneath the Sphinx that had actually been seen and visited by people over the course of 350 years.
Right.
I published all of these, and they're in several languages, English, French, and German. I translated the German, my wife translated the French. So in fact, as an appendix to the book, we actually did together we have everything that was ever published about the Sphinx from Pliny in ancient Roman times up till 1837, where we had to stop because it became too voluminous. And all of that is there, all translated into English, and it saves 100 trips to any library, like the British Library or the Library of Congress, because it's all there. And so I was able to report that there was indeed a chamber under the Sphinx, directly under its stomach, as it were, under its midriff, which was a late chamber, intruded, because it was described as having hieroglyphs on the walls. Before the 5th dynasty, there were no hieroglyphs on the walls of structures. So it was intruded, and I'm sure it was intruded during the Site period, or 26th dynasty.
Yeah.
As a tomb, but it was sealed up and filled with concrete in 1920. A Frenchman hired by the Egyptian government to tidy up the Sphinx for tourism. And that was the end of that. And he blocked the tunnel, because there was a tunnel that went from the back all the way to the front, where the priest could crawl through and speak through the mouth of the Sphinx as an oracle. People would think it was the Sphinx speaking. But
fascinating. Yeah.
But I couldn't crawl very far up that tunnel because it's in danger of collapse, and the whole thing's a bit of a mess in terms of the interior of the Sphinx.
I'm curious that, Robert, when we talk about the first contact, and you're saying basically there isn't a date because it's so universally referenced, and you're saying, these different ancient cultures talk about beings with fish tails, and there are sculptures of fishmen, and there's illustrations, and there's murals, and so forth and so on. The Dogon are just one people who had, according to you, interactions with these beings. Is that your suggestion over history?
Well, the only reason we know this is because the French anthropologists who published these accounts in the 1950s, and I met the surviving one, Madame Germaine Dutrelin, who was very much a grande dame. They got the confidence of the Dogon priests, who told them all this initiatory secrets about Sirius. There's plenty of other stuff to do with their mythology that was more widely known. But you see, nobody like that got the confidence of the Bambara, although we know that the Bambara and the Bozo and the Minyanka all had the same tradition. But the only tribe that opened up about it in great detail and drew all the pictures in the sand, because that's how they depict things, which is the ancient Greek technique, actually. That's what Plato used to do. With his stick, he'd draw his geometrical diagrams in the sand. That's what everybody used to do in the old days, because they didn't have paper, you see. And they're the only ones who opened up. So that's the reason why we only know about the details from the Dogon. But the other tribes have that, but then they ain't talking. And most of the priests have died out. And there's tremendous pressure for them all to convert to Islam now in Mali.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that for the most part, there are no written records of this. It's an oral tradition. And in the book, you actually show these sand drawings that represent Sirius and the constellations associated with Sirius A and B. And this was handed down. Are there mathematical theories?
There's a lot of physical evidence of all of this that goes back hundreds of years. For instance, they are very big on being blacksmiths, and they make things out of iron, statues and things. And there are iron statues depicting the Nommo that are 350, 400 years old. And there's a lot of evidence in the cave paintings, and because they live at the foot of a 1,000-foot cliff and full of caves, and it's all full of sacred paintings and objects and ancient statues and things depicting all of this. The physical evidence for these traditions is hundreds of years old.
Okay. That leads to my next question. And I think, if I remember correctly, and I didn't see all of the new edition, are there images of their craft, of the Nommo craft that actually landed on Earth?
Yeah, the Dogon do pictures, not of the craft itself, but of what it seemed like to them. When they landed, it was a swirly motion that stirred up all the dust and fire and flames coming out of the bottom. There is one picture that they did, which is basically like a modern rocket that you'd see at Cape Canaveral today. Yeah, it looked just like a rocket with a nose cone and everything. And they say that is one. They're very impressed by the noise and the dust and the flames of when the Nommo would land. And they depict this with many pictures, crude pictures in the sand, but you get the idea. and then they elaborate on it by talking about the picture. That's
Okay. So the Nommo represent themselves obviously as the beings from another planetary system light years away from Earth. Do they actually say we are the creator gods?
No.
Okay.
They call themselves the, well, I'm trying to think of the French word that there is used. Like the representatives. They don't claim to be gods at all. No, they absolutely not. No, they say they're just the messengers and they work for the god.
So they're
God is called Amma, A-M-M-A.
right.
And the god of ancient Egypt at the oasis of Siwa was Amun, A-M-U-N. Amun, it's the same god. And there is this one god.
Okay.
And so the Nammos never claimed to be gods.
Okay. But in this depiction that is so lively and factual, does this give us more validity for the other stories that the Babylonians, the Chinese, the Greeks, and others present to us of fish men and women? The Dogon version, in your eyes, the real solid evidence of alien interactions with Earthlings?
Well, I've given a lot more thought to all of this since the last edition was published years ago and back in 1998. It's very difficult to know because some of the depictions show sort of snaky type tails and some show fin tails. And they're very ambiguous because these are beings that have some sort of strange wiggly
appendages,
but it's very ambiguous as to precisely what's really going on. And so I've come to think more recently that it might be a cephalopod being, that is the octopus family, but a much more highly evolved octopus. Arthur Clarke once said to me that he thought that on planets throughout the universe that the predominant life forms would turn out to be octopoid, and that two-legged land-dwelling creatures like ourselves would be very much in the minority. And that was his opinion. And that stuck in my mind. And it may be that the Nommos were really sort of octopoids, but people couldn't quite grasp that. If you've got 8 legs, it's a little bit, and you didn't see it yourself, but your great-great-great-great-grandfather was trying to, you see that they got a bit mixed up about exactly what was going on below the waist. And it could have been that they were like dolphins with fish tails, but dolphins, as you know, are mammals, and they're not fish. And the same is true of whales. They could be amphibious, which dolphins and whales are. They breathe air. They don't have gills. And so there's no suggestion from anybody that we're literally talking about fish. When I call them fish people, I'm speaking in slang,
But you're describing their physicality.
Well, they weren't like fish from the head up, or from the waist up. They've got a head and so on. They're not fish-like, except their lower extremities. Everybody has trouble in ancient times and in the tribes descriptions describing what the lower extremities precisely were like, except to say that they were maritime. In other words, that these were sea-dwelling creatures who were not land-based creatures. They might have breathed air or they might not. This is thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
We have these multiple attempts to describe them, which are all very similar to one another, but vary in the details of what the lower extremities actually looked like. Bearing in mind that none of the versions that have survived are the original accounts, and everything got garbled over the millennia.
So you're saying that the original texts or whatever have been transcribed over the century?
No, it would have originally been oral traditions.
An oral tradition, okay.
This is all happening before there were written records. And so when the written records came along, they wrote down all this stuff, like on the clay tablets that the Sumerians and Babylonians had, and later they were succeeded by the Assyrians. And then the Philistines took up this tradition because their chief god was called Dogon, D-A-G-O-N. That was he was sometimes equated with the god El of the Canaanites. Most people don't realize that the famous Temple of Jerusalem, the foundations, apparently at the base of the East Wall, are still the original Canaanite blocks. When David, who was the king of the Jews who conquered Jerusalem about 800 BC or whenever it was, they took over the temple of El, which by the way, El and Elohim, which is the plural of El, are in the Bible as the name of God, one of the names of God. This is before Yahweh became popular. That was the Canaanite name. And the Canaanites didn't all die the minute the Jews came. The Canaanites and the Jews intermarried. This is before the Jews were so exclusive. And so the Jews who were actually from Jerusalem were all descended from the Canaanites as well. And they had this amphibious god, Dagon, and that was the temple of Dagon. I say Dagon, that's the English pronunciation. It would be Dogon. And the temple was then converted to the Jewish religion. And then, of course, that was destroyed by the Romans, as we know, which did not go down very well with the Jews who were then exiled. And the terrible story of the persecution of the Jews commenced and continued, and is still going on today, as we know, because anti-Semitism is everywhere. But their temple, which is the source of such dispute between Judaism and Islam at the moment, and indeed Christianity was wants to look into, is really on the site of, and it has the foundation blocks of, a Canaanite temple, which was before the Jews arrived. So the Jews then became mixed, so that the Canaanites and the Jews became the same people. But then some of the Jews went above Judea, up north, and they called themselves the Samaritans. And they have slightly variant versions of the Torah and the story of ancient Judaism before it became made into an official religion in the 2nd century AD and codified in what they call a Mishnah. It was full of all different kinds of sects who disagreed with one another. Ancient Egypt at the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, contained 1 million Jews. Mm-hmm. It was 1/3 of the population of Egypt were Jews, and they had a temple, a Jewish temple in Egypt, which was larger than the Jerusalem temple. And they looked upon the Jerusalem Jews as country cousins who were a bit simple, because the Egyptian Jews thought of themselves as very superior to those country cousins back in Jerusalem, whom they looked down upon. But I don't want to go into all that.
Yeah. Let's get into the details of the Sirius constellation, which I think is completely fascinating, especially in the light of nothing being written down. This complex, I mean, Sirius A and B is light years from Earth. 8.6 light years. Yeah. How was this information transferred to them? Obviously, at some point it was written down. Were there any, like the 10 Commandments, scratched on the walls, details of where they were? This was what this data that you collected, and the anthropologists ultimately were the front runners on this, is very, very interesting. Talk about the conveyance of this data to the Dogon people.
Well, of course, all the Babylonian stuff would not have reached the Dogon people, because that was in the Near East, and no Dogon ever went to Babylon. They're survivals of the same original information, which popped up in different places. The Babylonian, originally the Sumerian, Babylonian, and then the Assyrian texts were written on clay tablets in a script which is called cuneiform, which comes from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge, because they had wedges that they pressed into the clay, and it was wedge-shaped letters, and that's what's called cuneiform. And they have not just descriptions, but they have lots of pictures on the walls of the Babylonian temples of these beings, and of priests wearing costumes with fish heads.
All right.
As part of their ceremonies. And it's thought that the bishop's mitre of Christianity comes from the Oannes, Babylonian fish god's fish head that was worn by the Babylonian priests, because it looks exactly like a mitre worn by a Christian or Catholic bishop. I mean, I mentioned that as a rather sort of surprising detail. But this is all separate from the Dogon, because it's merely the information welling up in that part of the world. The Dogon tradition would have been of Egyptian origin before the Egyptian religion became what it is that we now know. So I don't believe that any visitation could possibly have occurred later than 3000 BC, and that would be impossible. But how much before that it occurred, I don't know. It may be that this is where the 5,000 years comes from.
Okay.
That's like a sort of upper limit. It couldn't be any later than 5,000 years ago. It could be much earlier. And this becomes very murky. And a lot of the evidence then becomes physical evidence rather than textual, because you have to study things like the pyramids. How did those gigantic things get built? And then even with very early cultures from 4000 BC along the Nile, there's a culture that did fantastic ceramics, paper thin, never equaled until similar ceramics were developed by the Chinese during the Sung dynasty, hence the Sung vases, Sung bowls are the most prized of all because you can see through them. And there's all kinds of evidence scattered here and there in fragments. And you try to piece this together and come up with a picture, but it's not easy, and it's easily challenged because you're trying to put things together to cohere into some kind of
So what you're saying is all these unusual, anomalous ceramics, buildings, pyramids, and so forth may have their origins from off-world beings.
Well, it's not impossible because they pop up and then they disappear, and then there's no explanation for them. And how did they do this? There are many, many technological anomalies and puzzles from antiquity. And to give you one example, I decided to focus on ancient optics and wrote a book about that called The Crystal Sun. So ask any archaeologist before I did that, did they have lenses in antiquity? Oh, no such thing as lens. Certainly not. So I started my research in my troublesome way that I do, always upsetting apple carts. And I went around the museums in different countries, and I found that they had lots of ancient lenses, most of them in the basements. And I photographed them, and I measured them and studied them. And I was an associate of the College of Optometrists, and I knew what I was doing. I knew how to do this. It was all professionally done. And I did my reports with all the measurements and the focal power and all that. And I found over 400 ancient lenses. Now, the early ones were all carved out of rock crystal, but by Roman times, they mass-produced them out of glass because they had the factories for that. And so you get a lot of old glass ones. But the crystal ones are the more interesting, and I was able to trace them back in different cultures. And astonishing feats could be achieved with these lenses. For instance, the notorious Layard lens, which is an Assyrian one. I think that was about 800 BC or 1000 BC. Fairly recent, and it was carved of crystal, and I was able to prove that it was carved for a very specific case of astigmatism, that an individual person, obviously a king, had astigmatism. This lens corrected his sight. Astigmatic correction lenses are rather complicated, toroidally ground. They're not simple to make, and you've got to know what you're doing. One assumes that they did this by trial and error because one assumes that they didn't have a modern science of how to correct astigmatism, and they did it over and over until they got it right. I mean, that's my assumption. But this lens exists. It's in the British Museum, and I did a whole chapter just on that lens because it was so famous. And indeed, it was also publicized by Eric Van Daniken as coming from space and so on.
Of course.
Everything with Eric Van Daniken, everything comes from space.
Yeah, it's all alien.
He's promoting his books, and he believes all this stuff, I'm sure, but he's far too extreme, and everything's, UFOs are coming from God and all this stuff. He made life very difficult for a serious discussion about all this stuff because everybody just says, oh, Eric Van Daniken is all nonsense, you see. And anybody who tries to discuss these things in a more rational fashion is classed with Eric Van Daniken. And yeah, I've met Van Daniken. He sought me out.
So I want to complete this discussion on this Nommo. Do they say to the Dogon people, we're coming back at some point, or we're going to be?
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. You're absolutely right to mention that. The Dogon claim that the Nommo will return. First of all, the Nommo admit that they can't see the star. They admit they've never met a Nommo. But the tradition says that the Nommo will return, and when that happens, it will be called the Day of the Fish.
The Day of the Fish.
Yeah, well, this is the French translation of the Dogon.
Right.
You could call it the Day of the Sea Creature.
And is this foretell a certain geological birth?
They will arrive from the sky.
They will arrive from the sky.
Let's not say fish because we shouldn't be saying fish because they're not fish. The thing is that we could call it the day of the sea creature, when they will return and things are going to shape up according to the way they see things, apparently. They're going to do what they're going to do, whatever that is, but they're not going to blow us all up or anything.
Yeah.
You're going to come back and it will be the day of the fish. Well, yes, they go on to say, and they will rule from the waters. In other words, from the sea, where they will continue to reside, they will impose regulations upon the earth.
Hmm.
They're not going to kill everybody. They're going to shake up the political system.
Wow, that's a fascinating thought.
Dogon say, who knows? A lot of people expect something like this. So I'm the messenger again
Of course.
other people's traditions. I'm trying to inform the public. I'm not preaching. I'm not insisting that anybody has to believe anything I say. I don't care if they disbelieve everything I say. It doesn't affect me because, I'm not an egotist, and I don't get upset if people say you're talking a little nonsense. Well, okay, they think I'm talking a little nonsense. That's their opinion. I'm actually very tolerant of everybody's opinions. I may completely disagree with them, but I tolerate and respect their views, and I understand why they think that.
Yeah.
People have different types of personalities and different backgrounds, and they have their views and plurality.
I think, the book obviously landed on the world stage and it was an international bestseller. People are still referring to it. Obviously, the intelligence agencies were alerted just because of your background. What does this say to you about Earth's ability to accept off-world contact if our agencies like the CIA, the Department of Defense here in the United States, NASA, European Space Agency, just can't seem to get over themselves when it comes to disclosure?
I agree that there is a big disclosure problem. And I think that they have dissension amongst themselves, because I've met people from NASA who are very, very sensible, but, they don't run NASA. This is the problem. And I've known a lot of really, really good people in that kind of area. But the thing is that it's who's in charge that's the problem. And there's a lot of dissension from below or from middle levels. The trouble is that the people who actually run things are political appointees. They have political agendas. Well, I suppose that they should, because America's a democracy after all, and these agencies should ideally be controlled by people elected by the public. That principle is good, but it is, I'm afraid, abused a great deal, and you get bad apples, awful lot of them, you could say. Now, I wouldn't say that it was good that I was persecuted for 50 years because I wrote a book about an African tribe saying there were beings from space. I mean, why should they try and destroy my life when I was a really perfectly harmless person who just was writing a book?
Well, that's my question. What have you thought about it? Why would they persecute you for your research?
Well, I think they do that it's a sort of standard default.
Yeah, it is.
They do that with anybody. I've had other friends who've been persecuted. It's not just me. I'm not a paranoid who feels I'm a victim.
Yeah, I understand.
I don't actually consider myself a victim because I expect this kind of thing. You see, I know enough about the real world to realize that these are real things that happen in a real world. I'm not.
But don't you think there are regressive policies? Wouldn't you think, and I've talked to other scientists on this program about this, when we learn that we're not the only ones in our cosmos, we automatically evolve as a species. And to repress that it doesn't help us at all.
I hope you're right. We don't know that for sure, but you have to realize that all the security agencies of the major countries look upon the question of extraterrestrial life as the number one security issue of the world, which it is. It is. In theory, it could be harmful to humanity. And they don't know. Therefore, they take the ultra-conservative position, which is presumably responsible, or they think it's responsible. I don't think that their behavior has been justifiable. They obviously think that they can do what they like because they've convinced themselves that they are the virtuous ones.
Yeah.
They are the guardians. They're saving humanity. But of course, it's all tied up with their power, lust, and their egos. And some of them are psychopathic.
Oh, God, that's all we need to hear about. Yeah.
There are lots of psychopaths in positions of power because they seek out power. Yeah. And people with no empathy or compassion. So they don't really rate the public. They have no interest in the public. These kind of psychopathic people, they look upon other people as things, and they don't have any empathy with the public. And they are not Democrats. I mean, they might be members of the Democratic Party, but they are not Democrats with a small d, if you see what I mean. I'm sure they belong to all the different parties. But the thing is that when I say they're not Democrats, I mean they don't favor democracy. They are authoritarian mentalities, and they think they know what's best, and we should shut up, pay our taxes, and get lost.
Yeah. The book's called The Sirius Mystery. My guest has been Professor Robert Temple. Robert, today it's 2023. What would you like the current reader, the new reader of your book, to get from your what impression would you like them to have of this work?
Well, what everybody should do is combine what I wrote in the Sirius Mystery with my latest book, which is called A New Science of Heaven, which gives a huge amount of further information. And it's about the universe being mostly plasma. As we've discussed it in a previous podcast, the universe is made of 99.9% plasma, not of atoms. And I go into that. And what this means is a revolution in physics. So that our physics that we have at the moment is Earth-based physics based on atoms. The real physics that we need is a plasma physics, and it exists partially, but it doesn't get much funding. And the thing is that on the basis of the plasma physics, I've been able to explain how there can be a kind of cell in space which contains both our sun and the Sirius system in the same cell, and that it could become conceived of as a dusty complex plasma cell, which then has long-range order, which would make communication between the Sirius system and the solar system easier than it would do if you're outside the cell. I mentioned this in the introductory chapter of the 1998 Sirius Mystery, but without knowing about plasma at that stage. And I can now explain it according to plasma. If you read both books, then you get a whole picture. Then anyone who really wants to go into it should look at my technical papers on researchgate.net. Type in Robert Temple, and they're all chronologically there.
Okay.
And there's an article there that I did with my friend Chandra Vikramasinghe in the journal Advances in Astrophysics about the two big clouds between us and the moon, which may be connected with extraterrestrial intelligence. And I suggest that maybe what we're looking for with our SETI programs is misdirected, and we should be concentrating on something else.
Okay, excellent. How can people read more about you? What's your website? What's your web listing URL?
Well, I have a personal website, robert-temple.com. A lot of stuff isn't there. It has about my books, and there's a lot of personal stuff of family and friends and nostalgia and all kind of things of that sort. People I've known who've died and whatever, and tributes to them, and it does have my books listed, but it isn't a website that's necessarily explaining in full about what's in each book. But a lot of the things I published are available as downloads, masses of articles and papers. And I mean, if you really want to know all that stuff, it's there.
Okay, excellent. I want to remind our listeners that Robert will be at the upcoming Origins Conference in
November.
It's in November 4th. And where's it going to be held? It's going to be held at Wiltshire.
It's in Wiltshire, in England. Let me just check.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right here.
Yes, it's on November the 4th, which is a Saturday, and it's at a place called Pewsey, Pewsey.
Okay.
Wiltshire, apparently near the White Horse. I've never been there.
And for more information, you can go to originsconference.co.uk, and you can order tickets. And I guess they also have your presentation title and what time of the day you'll be speaking.
I don't know any of that myself yet. I do what I'll speak about, but I'll think of something.
Great. Hey, Robert, real pleasure speaking with you. And I want to thank you again for writing this fascinating book. We need more books like this. And I hope that what you had to say about your interactions with the intelligence community doesn't frighten off any fledgling or new authors who are wanting to write about similar subjects. So,
well, let's hope not. And we'll have to see what happens, because I think that they've been very slowly, drip, trying to soften up the public for what they know perfectly well, namely that there is extraterrestrial life, and that they've been much too slow about it. And the recent developments with what's called disclosure, very partial, and fragmentary disclosure is still better than none, is a step in that direction. But I think they're fighting among themselves. There's some people who want to get on with it and other people who don't, and they can't agree, and it's all political. It's a bit of a mess.
Well, there's a lot of whistleblowers that seem to be coming out of different military departments, which makes it interesting when they come out and actually speak. And there also was a famous physicist, his name is Bob Lazar, who was part of this Area 51 in Nevada, that according to him, he actually witnessed various UFOs and saucer-shaped vehicles that were not from Earth. So unfortunately, he's had to go into hiding. His life's probably in danger. But
one thing I will say is that the descriptions of these creatures called the Greys, which one reads about with so many UFO reports, strike me as fabricant organic robots.
Yeah, there's some people that believe that's true. I have heard that.
If they exist, I think that's what they must be.
Amazing. Fascinating. Robert, always a pleasure. We're going to have you back, and I'll look forward to speaking with you in the future. Thanks for joining me.
Cliff, it's been great fun as usual, and I wish you well, and I greatly admire you and what you're doing.